So last week we ended with the most fundamental quality of what makes a person a person. And what makes a person is that we are made in the image of God. And so we talked about how we see this in Genesis 1:26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So all God's people are made in God's image. That is the one thing that is abundantly clear. And so when we talk about what it means, though, to be made in God's image, the one thing I think needs to be the fundamental truth about what it means to be made in God's image is that it must cover every single person. Therefore, we cannot say the image of God is the ability to read, because not every person can read. So something like that cannot fall under the image of God. It's got to cover every single person. And in order to build up an understanding of what it means to be those made in God's image, what I want us to do is walk through the uses of the word image in the Old Testament in order to understand first what an image is, which should then help us then be able to surmise and come to a conclusion of what is the most likely meaning of being made in God's image. And the next use of being made in God's image after Genesis 1 is, I think, probably the most enlightening when it comes to understanding what it means to be in another person's image. And that is Genesis 5:3. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his likeness, after his image. So repetition of those same two terms, image, likeness, and named him Seth. So in the same way that a child is in the likeness of his or her parents, we are also in the likeness of God. At least part of our understanding of what it means to be made in God's image, therefore, should be built under our understanding of what it means for a child to be in the image of their parents. And we know that means they share characteristics, they share traits. One is relatable to the other. So being made in God's image first shows us based upon Genesis 5:3, and the same usage of image in the New King James Version is translated as likeness. It means that God is not wholly other. Being made in God's image means first that God is not unrelatable, that we can understand God. That's what it means to be made in God's image. Because if our Creator God was someone who was wholly other, if we can't grasp anything about God because he is too far above, too holy, or too glorious, then we would also then say that we are not in any real or substantive way made in his image, which would then make Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 meaningless. But since it's in the Bible, we know that it is not meaningless, that it has meaning. The Bible, one way the Bible also communicates this truth is the Bible often uses what's called anthropomorphic language. Anthropomorphic is a really long word to say that the Bible uses images about God, pictures that relate to how we interact with the world. So it gives God eyes or hands when we know he doesn't really have those, because God is spirit. God doesn't need a pupil and a cornea and an iris in order to be able to see. He can just see all things because he is the spirit God. But that language represents truth that we should be able to understand and relate to. So the first thing we see about being made in God's image is that, like a parent to a child, we have characteristics that we can and that are shared with God. God made people with characteristics that he possesses. This makes it very different from the Christian view of God versus the Islamic view of God. Because the Muslims believe that Allah is wholly separate, that it would be demeaning to say that any person is made in the image of Allah. This also separates us from other world religions like Taoism, because Taoism also says the same thing, that the divine is undefinable. You can't put it into words. So the very fact that we are in God's image, what this should be is sort of a two-way street. And what I mean by that is being made in God's image should help us understand ourselves, because we now have worth and value and importance because we've been made in God's image, but it should also help us understand God as well. So how that works with us being made, having worth from being made in God's image, and the way to illustrate this is that the most expensive piece of art ever sold by a living artist, and I didn't get a picture of it up on the screen now that I realize that. Shoot, this is what happens when you write messages on the car drive to Florida. You don't get images in your PowerPoint that you wanted. But the most expensive piece of art ever sold by a living artist was sold at Christie's in New York auction house in 2019. And the piece of art is simply called Rabbit. And the rabbit is a silver rabbit sculpture that is made to look like a rabbit that is made out of balloons. It's made to look like a balloon animal rabbit, but it is instead made out of silver. Like if you would walk by and look at it, you'd just be like, oh, that's a balloon animal. But actually it's made out of silver, and it was sold for $91.1 million. Now, I'm going to say, if you or I made a golden dog that was shaped like a balloon animal, it would probably be worth less than the gold that it was made out of. Like probably melting down that gold would create a better value than the golden dog that we could make that was shaped like balloon animals. But Rabbit sold for $91 million. Why? Because it was made by Jeff Koons. And Jeff Koons, for some reason, is considered to be one of the most highly sought after artists in the art world. High-end art people love the guy. I do not understand why, but it was his imprint as an artist that gave that rabbit its worth. Now then, apply that to us as human beings. We are not the image of Jeff Koons or Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. We are the image of God. Like God put his fingerprints of creation on us. So this makes all of us of infinite worth because of the artist who made us. And praise the Lord, aren't we much more valuable than a silver rabbit that's shaped like a balloon animal? Because we can, in God's image, we are not just statues, but we can talk and think and create and design and self-heal and sing and praise and more. And God's creation of us brings us that value. But like I said, it's a two-way street. It also goes the other way. God's image in us means that God is understandable and that God is relatable. We can understand God's love, his mercy, grace, truth, righteousness, and holiness because we are made in his image. You see God himself driving home that point through anthropomorphic language. Because what is one of the things that God does to communicate his love and care over us? We see God calling himself Father. He did not have relations with a woman and then bring forth children in the world, but by God to call himself Father, that's a way for him to communicate that I am loving for you, I am caring for you as a father should for his children. So we can not only understand ourselves and our own value because we're made in God's image, but we can understand God because we are made in his image. So a lot to glean from Genesis 5:3, just simply knowing that a child is in the image of their parent, and we are all in the image of God. The next use of the image of God is in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. And I think this is one of the passages probably considered the most important of the image of God passages. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And why this one might be the most important is because Genesis 9:6 clearly shows us that the image of God was not lost in the fall. This verse not only comes post the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but I think even more importantly, this verse also comes after the chaos of man's depravity at the flood and the judgment that that brought about. So even after all of that chaos with the flood, where God's like, I'm tired that I made man, I'm going to cleanse the earth, we are still made in the image of God. Now, this is where I'm going to disagree with a lot of systematic theologies. Most systematic theologies that you see today, they'll put a little asterisk here, and they'll say, yeah, we're made in God's image, but that image today is fallen, or it is stained, or it is marred, or it is corrupted. So once we were fully in God's image, but now we're in God's image, but it's been corrupted. And those type of teachings are one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this series, because one thing I think is important to state is that the Bible never makes a claim that the image of God has been corrupted or marred or defaced in any way. Notice here in Genesis 9:6, it is just a simple statement. Don't murder. Why? Because we're made in God's image. And there's no footnote, no line in the verse that the image of God has been marred. In fact, if you were to take Genesis 9:6 and in any way add the teaching that God's image has been defaced in that, what would that do to Genesis 9:6? It would weaken the prohibition for murder. And that's what that passage is clearly doing. It's telling us you cannot murder. So you have a lot of theological articles like this one by the Gospel Coalition, which is an article all on what the image of God is in man. And one of the key teachings in this article, it's probably what's in there more than anything else, and that is that the image of God has not been lost, but it has been in some way been defaced. And the article actually uses the word that the image of God has been shattered. We have the image of God, but it's been shattered in us. But the thing is, the Bible just simply doesn't teach this. It's true that we have fallen short of God's glory. We have many statements about how we are sinful people, but the Bible never tells us that the image of God in us has been marred. The closest passage that any theologian can come up with to show that the image of God has been some way been defaced in us is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. So the thinking is that since we are being transformed from glory in glory into the image of Jesus Christ, therefore the image of God in us was defaced when we were fallen people, then we get saved, and then it slowly gets back and like repaired into the image that God desires us to have. But I don't think that fits for image. This again brings me back to the concept of Genesis 5:3 in the fact that children are in the image of their parents. Seth was in the likeness and image of Adam. And that didn't matter how he lived or how he acted. He could not stop being Adam's son or in Adam's image. He will always be in Adam's likeness. Yet at the same time, you could also say that Seth, as the son of Adam, could he not mature and become more and more like the glory of his father in the way that he lived and interacted with others? But Seth is still in the image of his father no matter what. So I think this is a clear illustration using the first use of image, that the image being passed on to God, the image of God being passed on to us, is something that we should grow into. We should become more like God in the way we love others, forgive those that are wrong us, in the way that we are compassionate, in the way that we walk in righteousness. But that does not at the same time mean that the image of God in us is some way marred or defaced. I think out of my 4 kids, the one who looks most like me and seems to most be in my image is Isaac. To me, like Isaac is like totally in my image. And one of the things that's kind of sad about Isaac is like the older he gets, like the more he just seems almost like this carbon copy of me that is like growing up here. And I feel bad for him that like he's becoming more and more like me at times. I'm like, oh, poor kid. Oh, we love you, but you'll make it, bud. Yeah, no, we're just having a joke. I was being kind of like a dumb dad to Naomi just this morning. Trying to get her up out of bed. And And so like I'm doing this stuff, and Olivia makes a comment like, Isaac, don't learn from him and do these things to your teenage daughter. And I'm like, Olivia, you can tell Isaac all the time not to do those things to his teenage daughter, but when he's a dad and he has teenage daughter, he's going to do exactly what I'm doing right now with her, because Isaac is in my image. And Isaac's sitting right there. He's like, oh, Dad, I'm totally going to do what you did right there when I have a teenage daughter. So he grows more into my image, but at the same time, you would not say when he was born, oh man, Isaac has a damaged image of Sean because, he looks like an old bald man. And he's got to grow into it. No, he was in my image from birth, even if he would become more in my image as he grows. And I think that's the picture that we see when we look at all of these image of God passages, that we should have no asterisk, we should have no lessening or corrupting of the image of God in us, because we need to always remember what truth of righteousness and justice is attached to the image of God in us. That is the sanctity of life. And why is it that every human life matters? The reason every human life matters is because we are all made in the image of God. And once you begin to say that the image of God in us has been corrupted, you devalue the image of God in us, to which the church and all Jews upon this earth should say, just fully in unison, every life matters because every life is created in the image of God. And it's just hard for me to imagine that there are Christians, and it's probably maybe even the majority of you in the church today, that they use that language of Richard Phillips in that Gospel Coalition article, talking about how the image of God is shattered. And they're saying that God so cursed us in the garden that he shattered the image that is in us. But then doesn't that make murder and other sins against other people not as heinous, not as terrible, because they're just ruining an image that's already ruined? They're shattering lives that have already been shattered by God himself. And I just don't believe that that makes sense at all. I hold to a very strong view on the sanctity of human life. And first, we use this phrase to talk about pro-life issues, and we always got to stick to that. Sanctity of human life, of that baby in the womb. John the Baptist leaping over Jesus in the womb. We see that in Scripture, the importance of that child as it develops in its mother's womb. But then that is not only about abortion, but that should continue throughout all of human life. When people get to old age, we don't say, oh, because their mental capacity has been decreased, because they're no longer physically capable, that they're not as valuable, they don't have as much meaning, but they still have the full image of God in them. So I'm just a huge proponent that when it comes to human beings, no person in any way has a defaced or a deformed image of God. Even after the fall, we still fully have the image of God. And that's what makes our sin all the more terrible, is that we have the image of God. And what do we do with the image of God? We do sinful things with it. And that is why it is such a terrible thing that we are sinners. Our next passage on the word image provides a pretty interesting wrinkle for our understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God. And that is Numbers 33:52. Then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their engraved stones, destroy all their molded images, and demolish all their high places. So the word image we find in Genesis chapter 1 for being made in the image of God. That word's used 17 times in the Old Testament. 7 of those 17 uses for image are referring to idols of false gods. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, when we read that God forbids the making of idols or graven images in his name, he doesn't use the word for image in Genesis chapter 1, but the word that's used for image in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is a word that is pretty much an overlapping synonym, has exactly the same meaning as the word for image that is used in Genesis chapter 1. And one thing that we're told in the Ten Commandments is that we are not to make idols because God is a jealous God. God is in no way to be likened to these false gods and the images that are made of the imaginary gods, the demonic gods' glory. But I also believe there's another reason that we're not to make idols, not only because those idols don't reflect the glory of our God, but another reason not to make idols is because God has already handcrafted all of the images of himself that he wants. And all of the images of God that he wants on earth are us. It is people. This is not in any way to be idolatrous or claim that we're in some way to be worshipped because we're the image, or you could even go as far as to say the idol of God. Far from it. But an idol is simply meant to be a physical representation of a God. And we are to be the physical representations, the physical rulers on this earth for God. We are to rule in God's place as stewards of this world that he created. In a way, idols do two things at the same time. If you were to make an idol of God, you're making a mockery of God, because how dare you say that that idol could in any way reflect the glory of God, but you're also, in a way, making a mockery of us, since we are to be the image of God on earth. I mean, think about it this way. God, when he created this world, he ended his creation of this world by specifically fashioning men in his image, by making man and woman to be his physical representatives on earth. And man, when God made an image of himself, he made an image. I mean, think about what people are able to do. We have a capacity for knowledge. We can learn. We can plan. Our bodies are self-healing. They're able to move around and do things. We have the ability to love and to find joy and to be compassionate. And all of that points to the glory of the God who made us. Now, compare the images that God himself made to reflect his glory with the images that people would make of him out of gold and silver and plastic. Like, what a pathetic mockery of what God has done. Like, no one is to make images of God, because God already formed images of himself out of the dust of the ground and breathed his own life into them. And any other idol, what it does is it makes a mockery of what God has done in the creation of man and woman. It's another reason to abhor the making of idols and images. The next use we have in the Old Testament of image is in 1 Samuel chapter 6. This is our first sort of non-religious passage of an image that we have that's not like a parent having a child as well. So 1 Samuel 6:5 says, "So you shall make likenesses of your tumors and likenesses of your mice that ravage the land. And you shall give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will ease his hand from you, your gods, and your land." So this is a deceptively important passage when it comes to understanding image, because this is really the one passage that we have where someone makes a direct physical use of something in the world and is like, that's the image. And the image we have here is mice that are made out of gold. So we have the golden mice of 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 5. And we can all make a guess of what these mice will look like. They'll look like mice that are covered with gold. Like, we can have all in our minds have something that is fairly similar of what these golden mice will look like. Doesn't matter whether I did like a whole bunch of searches online this week of like image searches on Google, some artificial intelligence image searches on mice out of gold, and I got pretty much the same type of image every single time. The only difference was sort of the posture in which the mice, or I even switched from mice and rat and still almost got the same exact thing in the images. Not a lot of difference there. You get the round body, the big ears, the long tails, the whiskers that are on there. So mice being made, a golden image of a mice means that you should be able to look at that image and say, oh, that's a mouse. So what does it mean that we should be made in the image of God? It means that people should be able to look at us and say, oh, there are the characteristics of God. That is what God is like. Uh, One of the things that I found most eye-opening that I learned in school when I looked at one of my professors was walking through the book of Exodus was one of my professors talked about what was most likely the perspective of the Israelites when they built that golden calf in the wilderness while getting the Ten Commandments. So we read the following account in Exodus chapter 32, verses 3 and 5. We read that all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord, to Yahweh." So we have in Exodus 32, Aaron builds this calf and says, "Israelites, this is Yahweh. This is the Lord who brought you out of Israel. Bow down and worship this golden calf." Now we see this and we think, oh, like they're worshiping an idol. And we think this is just such a horrendous thing to do because we're coming from our, thousands of years of Christian perspective. But when the Israelites built that calf and bowed down and worshiped, they most likely thought, we are honoring God and we are glorifying Yahweh who brought us out of the Red Sea by creating this calf and bowing down before it. Why? The reason is that they were herders. That's what they want to do, raise animals and take them around. We know them as being slaves making bricks over the last few generations, but their desired trade was livestock. Now, if you're involved in livestock in the ancient Near East time period, what was the most powerful animal you could own? It'd be an oxen. An oxen would be the most powerful animal that you could have on your farm. So they're highly praised for their strength, for their ability. Well, if you had a calf was viewed as an oxen in its youth and in its vigor. So this is like an oxen with the peak full life of its strength and its use and its ability before it. So when they built a golden calf, what they were saying was, "Lord, we believe you are strong. We believe you are capable. We believe you have great vigor because you have led us out of Egypt." So this in their way, this was saying, "Lord, we're praising you by saying these are all these ways that you're like a calf." And God was very insulted by that, to say the least. Why was God insulted? Because while an oxen has brute strength, there's another thing about an oxen as well. And that is an oxen is one of the most easily manipulated animals by humans. It's pretty easy to get an oxen and make sure that it does what you want to plowing the ground. That if you were even to take a statue of a person and shape it like an oxen, it would be insulting to that person because it's like, I'm better than that oxen. It's got strength, but I can direct the strength of that animal. And so for God to be made in the image of an oxen, that is so insulting. Like he is so much better than that. But they think they're paying God a compliment when they're not. Which all of this I'm bringing up to say, to show us that when people look at other people, we should be able to learn about God from other people because we're God's image here. In the way that you would look at an oxen and say it has strength and it has power, and that's why they made an oxen in the image of God, God made us so that we can know about him. We are made in his image. One of the underappreciated reasons that the Bible makes it so important that we are not alone in our worship of God is because we are to know about God through others, through the way we interact. One of the great passages in the Bible where God describes himself is Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. We read, "The Lord passed by in front of him," that's Moses, "and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth." So notice how God describes himself. God says, "I am compassionate, I'm gracious, I'm slow to anger, I love, I have loving kindness, and I'm true." Now, those terms that are all used by the Lord there are terms that only make sense in the context of interactions with other people. You cannot be compassionate alone. You cannot be gracious while you're sitting in your bedroom all by yourself. We need to have other people involved in those. So, one way that we know what God's compassion is when other people are compassionate to us and we need their help. One way that we know that God is gracious is when other people are gracious and they give to us what we do not deserve. We learn about truth by hearing the truth from others, or we learn about the opposite of truth when people lie in front of our face. If being made in God's image corresponds to the normal use of image in the Old Testament, and it must, or it's a nonsensical term and it's pointless language. When God made Eve after he made Adam, part of God's intention in making Eve was so that Adam could learn more about God. And part of the reason that Adam was there for Eve was that through Adam, Eve could learn more about God. That either of them alone, if God only made Adam or only made Eve, it would be insufficient for them to be able to fully display the image of God, because you need other people. And one of the reasons that you need other people to fully understand the image of God is that God, the one place he is unrelatable to us individually, is that God is 3 in 1. God is the triune person of Father, Son, and Spirit. So Eve needs Adam in order to learn about that relationship. Adam needs Eve. So while we're made in the image of God, I think the one place our image falls short of God is that we need other people in order to get that triune capacity when God can have it alone. So we're all physical representations of the unseen God, but we need other people in order to fully bring it out. So those are the uses of image in the Old Testament. The other passages I have not brought up are all in the category of image is an idol. I also want to point out the word likeness is also used in Genesis 1:26, but that word likeness is really just a synonym for image. Went through all the passages on likeness and none of them added or took away from what we saw before. So walking through all those passages, we get the same sort of idea of image in the Bible. And if there was anything left to glean from the word likeness, I would totally snatch it. Because at the same time period, after going through all those passages, I think we're still left with what's sort of the million-dollar question in the study of humanity and what it means to be a person living in this world. And that is, what is God's image in us?